Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In London, where I have lived for almost 50 years, people of some repute are expected to produce an autobiography. I shall never do so. I'm too fond of the truth for that. And there are many things that fascinate me more than my own personality. In this lecture, I shall concentrate on my musical life. I do not believe that artistic merits can be derived from or explained by an artist's private existence. Nevertheless, let me start with my parents. Neither of the two families included artists or intellectuals. And in spite of exhaustive searching, I have so far not managed to track down any Jewish ancestors. My grandfather's connection with music consisted in the fact that Gustav and Alma Mahler learned how to ride the bicycle in his cycling school. These were the times when bicycles were equipped with one big and one small wheel. Both my mother and my father belonged to German-speaking minorities in countries that, as they felt, treated them poorly. Both had taken a few piano lessons, part of a bourgeois routine, which I also experienced. As a little child, I had been taught a number of folk songs by my nanny before I could operate a record player at a hotel on the Adriatic island of Krk. Among the records, there was an operetta aria bellowed out by the tenor Jan Kiepura. It proclaimed that, whether blonde or brown, I love all women. You have heard it before. A nice one to sing along. In those days, the gramophone had still to be wound up. And when it was, out rang a 1920s hit posing the question, what is Mr. Myers doing on the Himalayas? My parents were loving and reliable. That counts for a lot. For the rest, there wasn't too much we had in common, as I discovered as a teenager, which had its advantages since I got used to finding out things for myself, a state of affairs that would become permanent. My two piano teachers, ladies both, one in Croatian Zagreb, the other in the Styrian town of Graz, left me sufficient musical leeway. The first invested a lot of energy in strengthening my little fingers, for which I am grateful. The other one told me that I was tense and needed to relax. She didn't tell me how, but it was interesting to find out myself. Towards the end of the war, there was an extended gap in my piano playing because there was no piano. With my mother, I fled from the Russian army that was occupying Styria and only returned there when it withdrew. Between 15 and 17, I made up for much of what I had missed out on. I lived in a medieval house in Graz where I shared a room with a cousin who studied medicine and seemed to have been oblivious to noise. I composed, drew and painted, wrote sonnets, and practiced the piano. And I read a great deal. A public library that was facing the house had retained in its cellars an ample supply of pre-war literature. When I turned 16, my piano teacher told me I should now continue on my own and give a first public recital. I should also audition for the great Swiss pianist Edwin Fischer, which I did the following year. 3 of his master classes that I attended during the Lucerne festivals made an impact that lasts to this day. I also met Eduard Steuermann, the pupil of Busoni and Schönberg. Apart from these encounters, I studied on my own. The program of my first solo recital in Graz, as well as its title, were devised by myself. It was called The Fugue in Piano Literature and would have frightened me in later years. At that stage, I didn't know what nerves were. The success of this debut calmed, for the time being, the nerves of my anxious mother. In 1949, I appeared with an orchestra for the first time. It was nothing less than Beethoven's so-called and misnamed Emperor Concerto that I performed in Graz in the Stephaniensaal, a concert hall I still consider one of the finest. Among other piano concertos that I tackled from early on were Weber's Concertstück, the Schumann Concerto, Liszt's Second Concerto, and Mozart's Köchel 503. It was a happy time without TVs, mobile phones, computers, Facebook, and Twitter. The voices of Hitler and Goebbels no longer invaded the loudspeakers. And many people, after the end of the horrible war, were skeptical and obliging. It was also an exciting time, as all the contemporary art that had been inaccessible gradually surfaced. My curiosity for everything that is new in art has stayed with me throughout my life. Since 1950, I lived in Vienna, at first with a great aunt who only after several years allowed me to hire a piano. Consequently, I had to throw myself at the mercy of friends and acquaintances in order to be able to practice for an hour or two. This had the benefit that I didn't practice too much. A pianist can ruin himself by too much practice. The house in which my great aunt lived was, at the time, one of the many Viennese buildings that provided running water only outside the apartment to be collected with buckets. In the early 50s, three things happened. I started to make records, an activity that would continue for half a century. Second, I did a concert tour of Spain and Portugal with a chamber orchestra that, apart from the conductor, consisted entirely of women. From Vienna, we drove in a bus covering 10,000 kilometers in 4 weeks. There was snow on the Montserrat, while in the valley below, the almond trees bloomed. Then came an invitation to accompany a Greek violinist in Athens. The trip by rail from Vienna through Yugoslavia lasted 52 hours. After the recital, the violinist said, "Can't you stay on for another 10 days? I'm supposed to play with the Athens Orchestra as a soloist. I would like you to take over my engagement." Thus, I did my first performance of Mozart's concerto in D minor. I borrowed the score, which still contained his written notes, from a pupil of Arthur Schnabel. Vienna, in the early post-war years, was popular with a number of American small and medium-sized record companies. Among the first works that I recorded for a tiny label were late Liszt pieces and Busoni's Fantasia Contrapuntistica, music that nobody knew. The record catalog in those days was fairly thin. Fees were small and recording contracts ridiculous. But I was grateful to have something that kept my head above water. At the age of 25, I did my first record for Vox, a company that later called itself Turnabout and kept me busy over the next 10 years. My first Vox recording included, besides Balakirev's Islamé, Stravinsky's Petrushka Suite, and Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. As well as recording a few Mozart concertos and some of Liszt's paraphrases, I embarked on a complete recording of Beethoven's piano works. It was a fortunate decision to start with his smaller sets of variations. They added something important to my knowledge of Beethoven. I realized that the purported titan was also able to compose with a light hand, enjoy being witty, and demonstrate his own individual version of gracefulness. The player can learn to characterize, to give each variation its own specific flavor, just as long as it is not one of those variation works that retain the character of the theme. It was by chance that I finished the first of my 3 recordings of Beethoven's 32 sonatas on my 32nd birthday. There followed many concert performances of the sonata cycle, an undertaking that needed 4 or 5 attempts to settle down. In fact, as I counted lately, there were 32 performances of the cycle altogether. I particularly enjoyed doing cycles of the 5 Beethoven concertos. For the Vox recording of the 5th concerto, Zubin Mehta was my very young conductor, facing the Vienna Symphony for the first time. Later, I would often join Zubin in Europe, North America, and Israel. In the late 50s, Michael Gielen made me learn the piano concerto by Arnold Schönberg, which we then performed in Warsaw at the first international festival of contemporary music that had ever been mounted in Eastern Europe. The public, who had never heard this kind of music before, made us repeat the last movement. Nadia Boulanger, the famous Parisian composition teacher who had trained some of the Polish composers, sat sulking in the balcony. She was completely devoted to Stravinsky, who, at the time, had not yet discovered the music of the Second Vienna School. Warsaw was in those days a city in ruins, above which towered the gigantic Palace of Culture. It had been erected by the Russians and is still there, too huge to be demolished. I've played the Schönberg Concerto 68 times, made 3 recordings of it, and given premiere performances on 3 continents. It has remained a problem piece, but one whose problems repay close consideration. Meanwhile, Mozart's piano concertos and Schubert's sonatas had become, as part of my repertoire, more and more important. And in the years after the war, sonatas by Schubert were rarely programmed. A performance of his 4-movement A minor sonata by Wilhelm Kempff helped to open my ears. Played in Vienna's biggest concert hall, it showed me that these works need a bigger space to fully come to life, and that they should be played orchestrally, dramatically, and cohesively. In this, the later sonatas differ from his impromptus, moments musicaux, or the piano chamber music, which, as it were, emerge from the piano, whereas the sonatas impose an orchestra on it. Already with the Wanderer Fantasy, he strikingly demonstrates that the work had gone far beyond the capabilities of contemporary keyboard instruments. The modern piano is so much better equipped to be turned into an orchestra with its sound, color, and dynamic range. In the 60s, German television gave me the chance of making 13 films that encompassed the last 7 years of Schubert's life, from the Wanderer Fantasy to the final sonatas. Subsequently, I often performed these works in 4 evenings. Incidentally, the time span within which Schubert composed his greatest piano and chamber music seems to coincide precisely with his affliction by syphilis. It took some time before the received opinion that Schubert's music was too lyrical, too long, and lacking in shape was left behind. Today, his sonatas are firmly established in the repertoire. Since 1970, I've lived in London. That means that this is the place where I keep most of my books and music. But I still do a lot of traveling. The fact that I was born in northern Moravia, went to Yugoslavia as a child, and moved from Zagreb to Austria before settling in London, combined with the life of a touring pianist, such an ambulant existence has always seemed to me a blessing. It didn't, however, need the Brexit vote to remind me that I'm a European. I value a certain measure of independence. I've never been part of an institution. I never organized series of events or founded a club. The only crowd, to speak with the Austrian writer Elias Canetti, that I'm not wary of is the public of concerts and theater. There were a number of reasons to settle in London. Before the disappearance of the Iron Curtain, Vienna felt to me rather provincial. 2 things convinced me of London's status as a musical metropolis: the Promenade concerts and the 3rd program of the BBC. Where else does one find a series like the Proms, where throughout the whole summer up to 8,000 people gather to listen evening after evening to orchestral concerts that are broadcast live? Both the Proms and the 3rd program were masterminded by Sir William Glock, a pupil of Schnabel. Glock had succeeded in freeing both institutions from their insularity and in internationalizing the performances of contemporary music. Before that, the Proms, gossip had it, were the only place where British composers could hear their work twice. The famous echo of the Albert Hall was later eliminated by round blue panels suspended from the ceiling. It is only fair to say that since then, British music has become a great deal more international as well. Today, this country's contribution to contemporary music is one of the liveliest. It's hard to imagine a more attentive audience than the standing promenaders. Confronted with the contrasting elements of the hall's interior, a French architect friend observed, half Colosseum, half brothel. The boxes are equipped with red velvet draperies. Albert Hall turned out to be one of my musical homes. I played there 35 times, including within orchestral concerts solo works, like Beethoven's Diabelli Variations and Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy. But I never attended the final night. It displays a chauvinism that is not to my taste. The records I had made so far were for smaller labels. A Beethoven recital at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, not one of my very best, triggered a second phase of my career and mobilized 3 of the big companies, of which, for the rest of my concert life, Philips became my home address. It seemed clear to me what I would do after my final concerts in Vienna in December 2008, lecturing, presenting readings of my poetry, coaching string quartets, writing, traveling. What remained open was how long the impact of my playing would continue to resonate. I count myself lucky that my recordings, even most of the earlier ones, still seem to be available. There have been musicians who in no time fell into oblivion. What further remained to be seen was how my health would hold up. Here, there were surprises, of which the breakdown of my hearing 6 years ago was the most inconvenient. Since the 70s, I frequently went to America, doing solo recitals mostly in the spring and appearing with orchestras mostly in their summer residences. One of them I became particularly familiar with was Ravinia. There, the Chicago Orchestra plays right next door to a railway station, which made Sir Thomas Beecham remark that this was the only railway station with a resident symphony orchestra. An exceedingly noisy, old-fashioned train invariably pulled into the station during the slow movement of my piano concerto. It is rather bizarre, but not without its own peculiar charm, that in these summer concerts, music should be performed in the open air for thousands of people, some of which were sitting on the lawn. The fluctuations of temperature were remarkable. I've seen the audience wrapped in blankets. On the other hand, I've played 3 Beethoven concertos in one evening at 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 90% humidity. Just once I dared to play a concerto without rehearsal. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the telephone rang and the manager of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra gave me the news that his soloist for the evening had just cancelled. Couldn't I come over and play something? It turned out that a couple of months earlier, the orchestra had been on tour with Mozart's D minor concerto. So I called a cab, and after a short conversation with the conductor, played the piece with Riccardo Chailly. In my experience, most conductors are helpful as long as they realize that the soloist thoroughly knows the score and isn't asking for something absurd. Among the friendly conductors, there were those who retained everything I had told them, and others who let me know after I said 3 things, don't tell me a 4th, I won't remember it anyway. Very old conductors usually need to be accompanied by the soloist. There were only a few conductors I avoided playing with, not for personal reasons, but because I knew that we were musically incompatible. I much enjoyed working with those with whom one could set up performances properly over a number of years. I'm thinking, above all, of my various Beethoven cycles with James Levine and Simon Rattle. It is nice if conductors try to accommodate the soloist, but there are also a few who cultivate the habit of cutting short the soloist's rehearsal time. This is bad behavior and provokes in the soloist a kind of murderous urge. Young players in particular are sometimes on the receiving end of such treatment. I have often said that I have learned a great deal from listening to singers and conductors. The reason is that for me, the sound of the piano is not the goal, but the point of departure. It has to be transformed. To make the piano sing, to turn it into an orchestra, is both possible and necessary. There are pianists who are not comfortable with an orchestra. They would rather steer clear from the constraints of ensemble playing and develop their own unfettered notion of rhythm and tempo. Is piano literature, in its incomparable profusion, not destined to liberate the player from superfluous shackles? Are not all those fantasias, toccatas, cadenzas, and recitative-like passages its quintessence? Chopin, I willingly concede, is such a soloist composer. With some restrictions, young Schumann and young Liszt may also qualify. As for the rest, great piano composers have all been ensemble composers, some of them first and foremost. Their piano works are often closely connected to their orchestral, vocal, and chamber music, and to the discipline of rhythmic cooperation, with all its necessary and possible flexibility as embodied by a good conductor. It seems to me highly unlikely that a great composer would sport two basically different rhythmic conceptions, one for solo and one for ensemble playing. My yardstick for rhythm and tempo is taken from the great orchestras and the best conductors. Tempo modifications that are not conductable and unavailable to orchestral musicians will, on the piano, be often superfluous. There are soloists who think that they may or even need to demonstrate all the liberties imaginable when there are no other players around who would get in the way of their spontaneity. I personally would much rather go the other way and listen before playing a Beethoven sonata to a good performance of a Beethoven quartet, let's say, by the Busch Quartet, no least with regards to respecting the score. Four musicians who have to play together are facing the same markings which, if they use a good addition, have been written down by the composer himself. In my younger years, great pianists were sometimes divided into two groups: Chopin players, who were dealing predominantly with the Polish composer, and the performers of a larger, mostly Central European repertoire. It seemed rather obvious that in order to play Chopin well, you had to specialize. It also helped when such pianists had Eastern European names like Paderewski, Kożalski, Brailovsky, Uninsky, Niedzielski, Czerny-Stefanska, or Pachmann and Friedman. What counted was a highly personal refinement that took hold of the player to such a degree that it was hardly applicable to other composers. I had studied a fair number of Chopin's works, but soon noticed that the Central European orientation was the one I would pursue. In the 60s, I made an exception and focused my attention on Chopin's relatively neglected polonaises, which I coupled with a selection of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies. I had been playing Liszt since my earliest performances at the conservatory in Graz. Liszt's music at that time did not have a good reputation. To me, the best of it has remained compelling enough throughout a lifetime. Dealing with Liszt the pianist will be able to realize that technical skill should never be in the foreground. Liszt should not be treated as a piano circus, but as music. Virtuosity never ought to be an end in itself, but a means of expression. There are among the Hungarian rhapsodies pieces of genius, provided that they are played with the necessary conviction. Here is number 15, Liszt's version of the Rákóczi March. the last great Chopin player in the old sense was Alfred Cortot. His recording of the 24 preludes from 1933 has to me remained a miracle. Throughout my life, it has never lost anything of its phenomenal freshness and daring. Meanwhile, Chopin, the Bird of Paradise, has been swallowed up by the musical mainstream. When I repeat that I have profited most from listening to singers and conductors, I do not want to diminish the lasting impact of a number of pianists. In my most excitable early years of listening, it was particularly Edwin Fischer, Alfred Cortot, and Wilhelm Kempff, who in concerts and on recordings gave me an inkling of what I myself hoped later on to accomplish. The playing of these three pianists was remarkably uneven. Kempff, a master of atmospheric playing, could be called an Aeolian harp. He sounded wonderful when the right wind blew. But the very best of these pianist performances have continued to serve as a yardstick. What in all their diversity did they have in common? They were great masters of sound and cantabile, and they were magicians of immediacy. When Fischer played, another veil was lifted from the soul. You witnessed a combination of seraphic simplicity, refinement, and nervous turmoil. In the best of Cortot's various recordings of Chopin's preludes, that of 1933, each of the 24 pieces has a unique, clearly distinguished profile. At the same time, they are played as a cycle in one big breath that ties the disparate characters together. The very first bars would at once establish the basic character of each piece with complete assurance. It was as if a kaleidoscope would be shaken and a new constellation was instantly there. All three pianists were also great chamber musicians, two of them professional conductors. Cortot was responsible for important orchestral premieres in Paris. Fischer toured with his chamber orchestra. What they also shared was the need to create wider musical contexts, to connect, to show how one thing leads into the other, and the first note to the last. Furtwängler, Bruno Walter, Klemperer, some of the great conductors among their contemporaries struck me in a similar way. It may have been a symptom of this generation that it didn't dissect, but rather bind the components together. Listen to one of the most moving examples of this style, Edwin Fischer's performance of the Largo of Bach's F minor concerto. There are different ways of establishing a career. The early sensational one is the winner of a major competition with extensive concert appearances and a recording contract does not guarantee continuous success. The danger is that an avalanche of publicity is all too speedily released and the flood of engagements descends on the young player who needs time to assemble a repertoire, learn about concert life from the inside, and find a way of negotiating through the age between 20 and 30 as a human being. A gradual build-up is necessary. The development should continue. Interest of orchestras, the esteem of conductors, and last but not least, the response of the public should lead to re-engagements. The word development is crucial. The debut of a pianist, even if brilliant, may just give a hint of his or her talent, while some violinists already at a young age are able to display a mastery that is available to pianists only later. And the public sometimes has to get used to performers even visually. A pianist who on stage cuts a good figure and doesn't move a facial muscle will have an easier time than those who are prone to producing grimaces, including myself. My own career, despite winning a prize in 1949, was not precipitated nor sensational, but progressed step by step. In hindsight, I'm very grateful for this. My potential was able to unfold in a style that was consistent with my largely independent way of working and thinking. Unlike many others, I've never been impatient. I knew there was a talent, but time would tell how sound it was and where it would lead. Of course, talent is not everything. What is needed as well is a good constitution, self-confidence and self-criticism, ambition and persistence, preferably without fanaticism, a good memory, good nerves, the gift of concentration, the readiness and joy of transmitting something to others, and sufficient skepticism not to take oneself all too seriously. One needs gravitas and lightness, flexibility and openness to the many characters of the music, and of course, luck. One of my strokes of luck was that the concert agents who took care of me were ones whose patience matched my own. There was on the whole enough stability in the organization of my concert life to suggest that in this profession, more than in many others, it seemed possible to be and to remain a relatively free person. I had already heard Julius Patzak, a quite distinctive tenor of around 60, sing Winterreise in Vienna with a lovely Austrian kind of diction. When I was in my mid-20s, I got a telephone call asking me to accompany him in a lieder recital. It was my first collaboration with a singer. The program included Janáček, Bartók, and a song by Richard Strauss with millions of notes in the piano part. Perhaps this was too outlandish for Viennese accompanists. There were two rehearsals. In the first one, Patzak was sight reading, while in the second, he mainly smoked. Then came years where I joined the baritone Hermann Prey at music festivals. Once, we even did an actual 4-week tour in his Citroën. After the first concert in Amsterdam, we were invited to the house of a musicologist. We sat down at the table on which a small plate with biscuits was displayed and started to laugh when our host said, "I trust you have had dinner already." On that day, quite a few things had already happened. In our hotel, the elevator was under construction, and the page turner forgot to turn the pages. Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, my next singer, had acquired the habit of not just appearing with accompanist, but, if possible, with piano soloists. Under his auspices, the accompanist mutated into a partner. It was evident that he valued suggestions and new ideas. He sang with open ears, and his mastery was so sovereign that he always appeared completely in command. The clarity of his diction was tailor-made for big halls. Fischer-Dieskau was the only leader singer who, on an international scale, could fill large halls. One of our Winterreise performances at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden in London remains to me particularly unforgettable. After another one in Locken House, he instantly disappeared and was carried away by a helicopter. The reason? He was pursued by a woman with a gun. Fischer-Dieskau's breathing technique was so superior that one hardly ever noticed him breathing in. Please listen to a performance of Schubert's Nacht und Träume. The third singer, also a baritone, was Matthias Görne, once again a supremely alert artist. The unity and intensity of music making never stood in question. Meanwhile, it has become common practice to open the piano lid completely, something that in chamber music and lieder has never been to my taste, or to that of other musicians a few decades ago. It is probably due to the request of sound engineers who claim that they can get a better recorded piano sound. Alas, the listener in the concert hall will easily get the impression of the singer being inside the piano and not in front. I have always used the quarter stick, even in live recordings. For me, singing cantabile is at the heart of music, one of its constitutive secrets. It is joined by telling articulation and on the operatic stage by gesture and movement. In Mozart's piano concertos, the player may at times turn into an imaginary operatic figure. Recently, a lot has been written about musical speech. The rhetorical element should, of course, not predominate, but rather complement the cantabile. Plasticity and clarity of diction will be an asset to pianists as well. Apart from the singers I worked with, I also drew inspiration from listening to opera and records. In the 50s, before the Vienna State Opera House had been restored, a famous Mozart ensemble performed at the Theater an der Wien. Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, Sena Jurinaz, and Irmgard Seefried were the leading ladies whose memorable appearances on stage have merged in my memory with the timbre of their voices. Soon they were joined by Christa Ludwig. The duo of Schwarzkopf-Ludwig remained to me the perfect pairing of Fiordiligi and Dorabella, with Graziella Schutti as the ideal Despina. Among tenors, Julius Patzak and Anton Dermota regularly appeared, and Erich Kunz was a peerless Papageno. Josef Krips or Karl Böhm conducted. Fritz Busch, whom Vienna finally got round to inviting, died all too soon. It took quite some time before the musicians and the public became used to proper execution of appoggiaturas. Just in case you are interested, appoggiaturas are those two-note groups in which the first of two repeated notes has to be sung or played in the Baroque style at a different pitch, usually higher. Opera direction at that time did not offer commentaries, paraphrases, or parodies of works, but stagings that communicated even to the uninitiated what was actually going on. During Karajan's time in Vienna, I witnessed memorable performances of Italian opera, Aida, Otello, Falstaff, but also Carmen, where, as I found, Karajan's particular domain. Under his baton, Leontyne Price sang Aida and Regina Resnick Carmen. At the Theater an der Wien, Furtwängler had conducted Tristan. How the opening moment of each act immediately conveyed the basic character of the music was unforgettable. One can verify this with the help of his great recording with the Philharmonia Orchestra. Of inestimable value to me were the recordings of two dramatic sopranos, Lotte Lehmann and Maria Callas. Lotte Lehmann came to Vienna as an old lady to give a singing class to which the Viennese singing teachers did not send a single student. the way she sang, or rather suggested Frauenliebe und Leben, because there was hardly any voice left, brought all of us to tears. As a 20-year-old, I hoped to achieve something by the time I reached 50. When I turned 50, I noticed that there were still a few things to do. In my 60s, there was a minor interruption. While performing both Brahms concertos on a concert tour, I overstrained my left arm. A reassessment of my repertoire that had so far contained a remarkable number of highly athletic pieces had become necessary. It remained to be seen how the public would react, but they were gracious about it and seemed to go along with my opinion that Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert had contributed a reasonable number of substantial piano works anyway. In addition, my repertoire had included a fair selection of works by Liszt and Schumann, while Bach, Russian, and French music were mostly excluded. A Bach recording for Philips was an exception. During 1976, I had played a program that at first glance may seem all too daring. It combined works by Bach and Liszt, Hungarian Rhapsodies, with Beethoven's Diabelli variations. While recording a few Liszt pieces, I finished one day early and took advantage of the spare time by recording, among other works, Bach's Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue and his unpredictable A minor Fantasy, as well as the other A minor Fantasy with the Fugue and the Italian Concerto. I'm glad that this Bach recording came about by accident. Why then didn't I play Bach both more often and more regularly? There had been an upsurge of period performances that had rejected modern instruments. Another quite different reason was the impact of Edwin Fischer's Bach playing, for which finding an equivalent seemed to me a very tall order. Fortunately for us pianists, the rights of the modern grand have meanwhile been re-established. Concert tours took me repeatedly to Latin America, Australia, Israel, and Japan. I stopped going to Latin America already in 1961. The organization of these trips was, to a scarcely imaginable extent, left to chance, and pianos were bad. Besides, I was busy enough elsewhere. I particularly remember a recital in San Salvador where a rat appeared on stage. And the conclusion of my final tour. Before my departure from this continent, I was supposed to play 3 concerts in Buenos Aires. Schönberg's piano concerto at the Teatro Colón, a benefit recital for the Austrian embassy, and 2 Mozart concertos at the Mozarteo. We rehearsed Schönberg, and the notes were gradually becoming recognizable when Pope John XXIII died and all entertainment was cancelled. First, there came a telephone call from the Austrian ambassador who told me that the recital should nevertheless go ahead. This would definitely have met with the approval of the deceased. But he urged me to modify the program and eliminate the Schubert sonata in order to avoid frivolous associations with Lilac Time. This was an operetta today mercifully forgotten that ruined Schubert's image for decades. In the film, Schubert was embodied by Richard Tauber. I assured him that the big A minor sonata was a tragic work and played it, of course. The next call came from my Argentinian agent, telling me that he knew that I was unable to prolong my stay and therefore had the following proposal. After the end of the period of mourning, I should first get the Mozart concertos out of the way and then be driven over to the Teatro Colón for the Schönberg. Thus it happened that I appeared on the same evening in two different houses with two different orchestras and conductors. The tour of Australia that followed on was splendidly organized. The man in charge was a certain Mr. Moses, whose hobby was chopping wood. In his office, there was a cupboard full of axes. In order to demonstrate how sharp-edged they were, he selected one of them, rolled up his shirt sleeve and shaved off a few hairs on his arm. In Ballarat, a particularly chilly Australian place, I told the freezing public that I just wished I had an axe on hand to demolish the concert ground. In Israel, I had to do what I never did anywhere else, to play 6 days a week. Fortunately, there was the Shabbat, which provided me and the orchestra with a free day. I was deeply touched that at the celebrations for Arthur Rubinstein's 100th birthday, I was invited to participate as the only non-Jewish pianist. When playing in Japan, I never failed to visit Kyoto to discover some new temples and to go to Nara, the wonderful old capital, where many deer roamed the streets trying to steal chocolate from ladies' handbags, while stags rummage in the dustbins. Next to a great many appearances with orchestra, and at least as many in recitals, there were the recordings, the number of which, in hindsight, has surprised me. It is a strange feeling looking back at so many records, an offspring of which some never seriously grew up. My studio recordings for Philips were more and more supplemented by live recordings without me having a marked preference to either. I became accustomed to playing in the studio with an intensity similar to that in a concert hall, while live recordings turned out to be mostly happy finds amongst the radio recordings of my concerts. In the studio, one is able to listen to playback, react critically, repeat, and edit, while what counts in a live performance, in a live production, is the risk involved of getting through it all in one go. Both have their advantages. No one, I think, would be able to spot the edits in my studio recordings, if any. The precondition is that the performance needs to have a concept. My warmest thanks go to my producers for their committed assistance. Alongside my musical responsibilities, my other career, that of a writer, gradually developed to become a second creative life. I wrote about music and matters connected to my piano playing until my poems surprised me. Obviously, they were part of my personality, but they showed an alter ego. I would claim that there are a number of dimensions in myself that supplement each other, serious and non-serious, sense and nonsense, doubt and conviction. Only in contradiction does the world seem to become a little less absurd. There are in me a number of houses and doors. Whoever looks for the Dadaist in my piano playing has tried the wrong door. As a writing pianist, I was called a savage philosopher at the piano, or even in America branded as an intellectual. That's what happens if you publish books, wear spectacles, and don't play Rachmaninoff. But in all this, the feeling for and seeking out of musical elements have always been more important to me. Anyone who has watched me teaching knows that I do not waste too much time on dogma or analytical explanation, but work precisely on the notes, on their value, color, and nuance, on balance and cohesion. Over many years, I particularly enjoyed it when string quartets were seeking my advice. The fact that I'm not a string player myself didn't seem an obstacle, but rather an advantage. My awareness of what string players can do has developed from my own piano playing. Strenuous as the life of a traveling pianist can be, there is no shortage of surprises. During my orchestral debut in North America, the middle D kept sticking in Brahms's D minor concerto. I had to constantly lift up the key during my playing. But that was not all. In the course of 2 further trips to Montreal, there was a similar mechanical jinx at work. While practicing at Meadowbrook, the summer pavilion of the Detroit Orchestra, a dead bird that had hit the pavilion's ceiling thudded down onto the floor right next to me. During a Beethoven recital at Carnegie Hall, I heard a strange noise between 2 movements. It originated from a dog that was ushered out with its escort, who apparently kept protesting, "This is Mr. Brendel's dog." In Cali, a Colombian city of ill repute, the entire pedal came down at the final chord of Schumann's symphonic etudes. And in Algiers, where French soldiers with machine guns patrolled the street corners and the musicians of the orchestra were searched for weapons, I was requested to play Liszt's Totentanz, followed by Beethoven's choral fantasy that had been provided with a French text in which the word patrie appeared as often as possible. After my final concerts with the Vienna Philharmonic in December 2008, lectures on music and performance have taken up some of my time. I've given talks on Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and the sometimes misunderstood and misrepresented Liszt. Other subjects that have been of interest to me for many years were character and humor in music, as well as certain habits and dogmas of present-day performance practice. When in Stuttgart I described Beethoven's Diabelli variations as a compendium of musical humor, I was fiercely attacked by a newspaper. It seems that the idea of a Beethoven who in his late works had left behind all that is worldly and is floating transfigured somewhere above the clouds has remained precious to some minds, along with the conviction that the comical is something inferior which is ill-suited to those of a serious cast of mind. Of course, there are also overreactions on the other side. Young musicians who try to express musical humor easily exaggerate. I concluding my pianistic career without tears. This should not be interpreted as a lack of musical commitment. I loved to play, but I was ready for the farewell. 60 years of activity seemed sufficient. And it was to me of paramount importance to stop as long as I was still able of monitoring my sense of rhythm and nuances. In some respect, these last years have been more demanding than the concert years before. Whereas then, I was able to focus on a limited amount of works per season. Now, nearly each appearance brings new challenges. Lectures, meanwhile, there are 9. Conversations, readings of my poetry where I vary the selection and sequence, the writing of new essays, the coaching of chamber music or the preparation for an undertaking like the Berlin Homage have kept me up to the mark. To which I should add the reading of books, magazines like the New York Review, and newspapers with their sinister reports on the global situation. But I still manage to laugh. Not as much as before, but enough to survive. As long as you can find things funny, not everything is lost. I feel awe and enormous gratitude when I recall how Beethoven and Schubert, Haydn and Mozart, Bach and Handel have imbued me with energy and rapture, how all that is new in music has nourished my curiosity, and how the arts, literature, theater, and film brought about epiphanies, but also critical discrimination. There would be some good reason to talk about love, but I promised not to become too personal. Let the music speak.